Hello everyone, this is Darion of GNB. Yep, that's right, we're back with our annual GNB Spooktacular. This time we're venturing into Camp Blood to go over the Friday the 13th franchise. My relationship with this series is quite simple. Every once in a while, growing up, when I felt like I had my big boy pants on, I'd try, keyword being try, to watch these movies. Before finding out that I'm still a little piss baby, turn them off halfway through and proceed to have nightmares for a week straight. Yeah, these are among the horror movies that, try as I might, I couldn't make it through. As I got older, there were a few that I did manage to sit through, and we'll get to those eventually. I say all of this to bring up that this is the first G&B Spooktacular where the franchise that I'm reviewing, I actually haven't consciously sat down and watched every single minute of. So some of these are going to be a bit of a first time viewing for me. Not entirely, as I have vague knowledge and recollection of certain characters and story beats and whatnot, but by and large, quite a lot of these I haven't actually sat down and watched all the way through. For my own sake, these videos will have me reviewing all 12 Friday films, 3 in each one to be precise, and a few extra as a little surprise if I have enough time to do so before the month is over. And all of that brings us to the 1998 original, Friday the 13th. The story of the original Friday the 13th centers around a group of camp counselors aiming to repair and reopen the fabled Camp Blood, aka Camp Crystal Lake, until they are all mysteriously and brutally taken out by an unknown assailant. The Friday series is going to be a rather complicated, at least for me, series to go over, as the vast majority of these films are not really story focused, and that includes the original. Yeah, the plot for the movie is paper thin, not much intrigue beyond the initial summary I just gave. Although, on this rewatch, I didn't notice how much they try to play with the whodunit angle. Yeah, obviously the killer for a majority of the film is not shown to the audience, but I just really wasn't expecting them to lean into it as much as they did. With various red herrings, a decent amount of foreshadowing, there's a pleasant surprise this time around. And yeah, I'll get to the killer reveal and all that, but something else I also wasn't expecting was for this movie to have such a good handle on tension and atmosphere. There are several moments and scenes that linger on and really allow you to be in the moment and feel the unease, and it was really effective. Also, this next bit is less of a positive for the movie in full retrospect, but I just love the charm that these old school horror movies have. Whether it be this or Evil Dead, the slightly amateurish feel some of these flicks have just gives off a certain charm and feel I can't help but find endearing. This movie as well does a decent job at world building, at setting the stage and getting you intrigued and invested in the story of Camp Crystal Lake. The ghost story aspect of this cursed camp is really cool and interesting. Starting with the drowning boy, the 2 counselors murdered the year after, the water supply being tampered with upon an attempt to reopen it a few years prior to these films' events. It's all just some really cool and interesting stuff. The characters in this film are about as bare bones as the actual plot, in that they aren't that special or memorable. I watched these 3 movies back to back, and the cast of the original I remember significantly less compared to the other 2. The movie spends a ton of time with these guys, but not enough to become really invested in them individually. I'll say, and this is again not that much of a compliment for this film itself, the way these characters are written doesn't really evoke any of the common tropes that this series would set in place for the horror slasher genre. So I can't help but appreciate how down to earth these characters feel as opposed to being caricatures. It's not 100% overplayed, but a good chunk of these guys are, like I said, more simple. Our final girl of the film, Alice, is fine. This movie really takes a similar approach to Evil Dead, where the movie doesn't really have a central protagonist for you to follow, and instead just dumps you with a bunch of characters and you're waiting to see who's left after all the chaos. I know Evil Dead came out the year after, but that's just the first thing that came to mind. Alice as a character is okay, but we never really get any intricate time to learn anything interesting about her as a character. She just kind of exists, until she's inevitably the last one in the end. I would bring up the other characters, but like I said, they aren't particularly memorable. But I guess it wouldn't hurt to do a quick rundown. Annie was a decent character. She's who the film tries to initially lead you to believe will be our final girl. She was alright, being a sweet, bright-eyed girl hoping to have fun as the cook at the summer camp. It was a shame to watch her die, but otherwise, meh. Crazy Ralph was a decent red herring, I suppose. I think that's the purpose he's meant to serve anyway, as he's the only character introduced in the film that would seemingly be crazy enough to do all this shit. Despite his very weird nature, all he tries to do is warn the others of the bad shit that goes down at Crystal Lake. which was pretty nice of him, I guess. Steve Christie was alright. They allude to him and Alice having a thing, but something about the character interaction seems so off, I'm not sure how I'm really meant to view them together. Anyway, he was, like I said, just alright. Folks like Brenda, Bill, Ned the Jokester, which is an archetype this franchise is obsessed with, Jack, played by Kevin fucking Bacon, holy shit, and Marcy all just kind of blend together. Like I said, nothing really notable about these guys. But we of course have our killer, the iconic Pamela Voorhees. Sidebar, it's so fucking funny watching people get introduced into the Friday films expecting a hockey masked, machete wielding killer, only to have it be this seemingly kind and innocent old lady. Pamela Voorhees is a character that upon this most recent rewatch, I'm a bit iffy on. Because having the killer be introduced to be this old lady and having the motivations be her going crazy after the boy that drowned, her son Jason, was a pretty interesting twist. I think. Could this really be considered a twist, per se? I mean, maybe, as I doubt people were expecting this random lady to be the killer, but at the same time, this movie made no mention of any Pamela Voorhees before this reveal, so it almost feels a tad awkward. It's not bad, but just a little weird. Anyway, being introduced to her and having her psychotic nature slowly unveil itself was handled incredibly well, as she's genuinely frightening some of the time. Some of the time. Yeah, while Pamela is undoubtedly unnerving, she's also equal parts funny, at least to me. And this next bit really doesn't help with that. Because upon this rewatch, I noticed something that really bothered me. And it's the fact that after Pamela is revealed, she suddenly becomes really bad at killing. Like, she killed at least 8 people in this movie, no sweat, but once she reveals herself, her ass is getting slapped around and all types of shit. The third act in general kind of drags the movie down for me a bit, because all of the tension that the movie had been building up just kind of comes crashing down as Pamela proves herself to be a kind of incompetent killer in the end. And FYI, that problem doesn't exactly go away in the following film either. To circle back around to Alice really quickly, another thing that drags about this final act is so much damn repetition. You have Alice knock Pamela out, then run away. Knocks her out again, runs away again. Knocks her out another time, then runs away again. It's just rinse and repeat. Anyway, Pamela as the killer was a decent surprise, and I like how they allude to Jason periodically throughout the film, which just makes Pamela's reveal more interesting. The ending to this movie I thought was pretty effective. I know some folks aren't a fan of the fake out ending with a decomposed Jason dragging Alice into the lake, only for it to be revealed that she was completely fine. But that ending, even though I doubt they fully intended it, was so brilliantly haunting. The hint that Jason is still out there at Crystal Lake was done brilliantly.
The boy. Is he dead too?
Who?
The boy, Jason.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
Then he's still there.
The performances were fine. Nobody in the film was terrible, but none were all that good either. The standout would of course be Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees. She did an absolutely stellar job at bringing this crazed mother to life, which is even funnier considering that she didn't give two shits about the movie and just did it for the money. But regardless, she was great.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her. Don't let her live.
I won't, Jason. I won't.
The practical and gore effects hold up significantly well, far more than I initially thought they would. Now, I think overall they're just a tad inconsistent. Some stuff with the neck slits often look a bit off. I won't knock the movie for that as a whole, it was 1980, just something that I felt like pointing out. But overall, the effects are pretty damn good. And with all that, the kills as well are pretty sick. The guy stuck with the arrows, the Kevin Bacon neck stab, Pamela's decapitation, all looks pretty solid. Something else that can be said about this movie is the amazing sound design and score. The little musical strings that play during the kills, or when the killer is sneaking around, are probably some of the most iconic pieces of music in the horror slasher genre. Not to mention the iconic is absolutely chilling. Overall, the original Friday the 13th is just okay. It's a pretty adequate horror film that has a really good handle on tension and atmosphere, plays around with directing and point of view shots fairly well, A good amount of world building, practical and gore effects that hold up surprisingly well, but the characters don't really offer much, and we only really have about one actress that's noteworthy in the whole cast. The final act as well just kind of drags the thing down a bit for me as well. As a whole, Friday the 13th was alright. And I doubt that'll be that controversial of a stance for me to take, considering that I don't know a single soul who considers the original Friday the 13th to be among the best of the series, like a lot of other horror franchises out there. But regardless, let's move on to 1981's Friday the 13th, Part 2. Friday the 13th Part 2 takes place 5 years after the original, and centers around a group of counselors in training venturing to a neighboring campsite of Camp Crystal Lake, and sees them one by one be brutally murdered by the fabled Jason Voorhees. Like I said, this film came out just the following year of its predecessor, and if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that I'm often apprehensive about films releasing that close to each other. And I'm kind of right to be so, as this movie to me doesn't really live up to the original. Which is kind of sad because I don't even think the original is that good to begin with. The story for this one is pretty similar to its predecessor, and I don't just mean in regards to it being extremely bare bones, but that is true as well. I also mean that by and large, this is almost the same movie but with a different killer. Already, this movie begins a tradition in the Friday franchise that I love to hate, and it's the absolutely batshit insane continuity. I'll go ahead and get this out of the way. Like I mentioned in the initial summary, the killer in this movie is none other than Jason Voorhees, the young boy that drowned at Camp Crystal Lake, which kicked off this entire saga. This movie's mere existence already disregards and contradicts what was established, literally in the previous movie. It doesn't annoy me, per se, especially with how iconic Jason will later become, but it's something I can't help but point out. Anyway, I'll go more in detail with how I feel about Jason in just a bit. But I will say, this movie does start off pretty strong. I know the folks behind the original film didn't shy away from hiding the influences from John Carpenter's Halloween. So I gotta say, the opening of this film does evoke the same vibe and feel. I also love how they carry on the tradition of killing off who we think will be our final girl. I don't know how shocking it may have been back then, but starting off the movie with Jason immediately axing off the last survivor of the previous film is certainly a killer way to start off the movie. I would be pissed about this, but Alice wasn't that interesting of a character to begin with, so it's honestly whatever, I guess. This movie as well, like its predecessor, does a great job with tension and suspense. I'd almost say it does a better job than the original. That mainly has to do with the fact that the ending carries on a bit more of the film's momentum than the previous one. Not a whole lot more, just a little bit. But regardless, everything I had to say about the directing and how much certain shots linger and hold still hold true for this film as well. Once again, the world building for this movie was pretty good, I'd say. With a 5-year time gap, that allowed for more of a legend amongst the camp counselors to form about Jason Voorhees. And it's just something I love to see, as they treat Jason as this mythological figure, a wild animal-like thing that hunts and murders any who come near his territory. Just some cool shit. The characters in this film are significantly more intriguing than the previous one. They're all just as down-to-earth as those from the first movie, but more work was done to make each of them more endearing and likable. Our final girl this time around, Ginny, while more effective than Alice as a character, I still personally don't think she's that memorable of a final girl, generally speaking. As a character, she has more going for her, as she just has a pretty infectious attitude and personality that bleeds through right from her introduction. But as a final girl, I feel like she kinda had the same problem Alice did, where she felt a tad incompetent in certain situations. Characters being dumb in horror, I personally tend to give a bit more leeway towards, because I know for a fact that I, and like 80 to 90% of the people watching these, wouldn't have all the answers on how to handle these situations immediately. That said, yeah, I just don't think she stood out that much in comparison to Alice. There's also this other thing that kind of bothers me about this character. In the movie, they establish that she studies child psychology, which would help her deduce how she can properly evade Jason, and I'll get into that in just a bit. But the scene they chose to showcase this in before the finale came across so damn heavy-handed to me. It's one of those things in movies where a character is a bit too knowledgeable about someone or something, to the point where it feels like the character just went and looked at the script themselves. While hanging out with some friends, she goes on this long spiel about why Jason is the way he is. Seeing the only person who cared for him, Pamela, be brutally murdered and all the messed up stuff that comes with that. I understood what they were trying to do here, but it came across so forced to me. If they dialed it back, I probably wouldn't mind it as much. That said, it does lead to probably one of the best scenes in the series for me. And it's when Ginny uses her quick thinking to pose as Pamela in order to confuse Jason. This was really effective and makes good use of what they set up with her earlier in the film. Ginny as a character I find to be fun and interesting, but that's kind of it. I was shocked to find out that she's most people's favorite final girl and hold her as one of the best in the horror genre, when to me she's just pretty good. That's really it. I guess I'll talk about Jason now. Jason was really effective as a killer, almost more effective as a killer than his mother. That may be due to how significantly less emotive he is. He doesn't say a single word, and it just adds to that inhumane nature of him. He's still not that good, however, as, like I mentioned earlier, he has that symptom of becoming a bad killer after he's revealed. It's not to the same extent as Pamela, but he still looks goofy as shit. But to go back to that scene I just mentioned with Ginny impersonating Pamela, I think that's one of the few times, at least I can remember in this franchise, that really highlights how the story of the two Voorheeses is just really damn tragic. It's a scene that perfectly encapsulates the really fucked up nature behind these two and how they became these crazed killers. Another thing I have to bring up when it comes to Jason, and this circles back to what I mentioned earlier, is the continuity. The fact that Jason, thanks to this movie, presumably survived his drowning and just wandered around the wilderness for almost 2 decades and never reached out to Pamela because... Hell, apparently he watched her die. That's how fucking close he was to all this shit. Whatever. Jason was pretty effective as a killer. A bit more effective than his mother, but not by much. Now to do a rundown of the rest of the cast. Some of these guys kind of blend together, a lot like those in the first movie, but there were more of them that I found myself getting invested in. I found Paul to be a fairly effective deuteragonist. I guess that's the role he served here. His relationship with Ginny was pretty good. Nothing special really, just that they paired off pretty well together. Jeff and Sandra were... okay. They just existed. Mark and Vicky, however, I loved and adored. They were cute together, and it was a real shame to see them go the way they did. Especially Mark, but I'll get to that later. Ted was a decent comic relief character for the little time he was around. Crazy Ralph returns briefly before being axed off. And then there were these two, who, I'll be honest, I can't be bothered to remember the names of. They also existed. While not everyone was memorable, I think the cast overall were far more engaging and endearing than the previous film. The acting as well, I think, saw a big uptick in quality. Not substantially, mind you, I just see the folks in this film give more of an effort than the previous one. The gore and practical effects were once again pretty damn good. If there's a significant problem I have with this movie and its kills, it's that for most of them they quickly cut away so that you don't see much of it. Which, needless to say, is pretty damn lame. Regardless, the ones we do get to see are pretty cool. Mark's death was gnarly as hell. That one guy whose name I forget for the split second we see of the neck slit is pretty cool. Okay, as I was recording this, I'm just now recalling how many lame off-screen deaths there are. What the hell? What we see of the kills are pretty cool, but it's pretty lame just how much they don't show. I gotta say, this movie as well has a bit of trouble with how things end off. Now, the final act of this film, I'd say, doesn't drag it down for me like the first, but the ending is just really odd. You can tell they tried to recapture the vibe of the original's ending, but just failed miserably. Okay, first off, what the fuck happened to Paul? Jason attacks the guy, they tussle for a little bit. He's presumed dead as Jason chases after Ginny, but then the motherfucker just pops up unscathed. They try to do the whole dream sequence kind of ending, but it's significantly worse. Because it's really unclear what the hell even happened. Ginny stabs Jason in the shoulder, they leave and make it to one of the cabins. The dog that Jason killed the shit out of earlier in the movie shows up for some reason. Jason bursts through the glass and grabs Ginny, and then she just wakes up getting wheeled off to the hospital. Paul's ass is nowhere to be found, and neither is Jason. Where the original ending was kind of left open-ended as to whether or not Alice got pulled under, this ending is just confusing as shit. How much of that was a dream? What the hell happened to Paul? And none of this shit gets answered in the following film, so that's just fucking perfect. Overall, Friday the 13th Part 2, while not as good as the previous film, was still just an okay horror film. It's shot and directed well, with way more intriguing characters to guide us through, with a really effective killer, for the most part, and final girl. And decent practical and gore effects. The ones we get to see, anyway. But unfortunately, with the underwhelming kills and gore, very repetitive and bare-bones story, and weird-as-hell ending, this movie is, once again, just an okay horror flick. Now on to Part 3. Friday the 13th Part 3, or Friday the 13th 3D, if you're a jackass, centers around a group of youths hoping to enjoy some time at a summer retreat. until they are all hunted and killed by the returning Jason Voorhees. Be prepared for the plot summaries in this spooktacular to sound very repetitive. Already, Friday the 13th Part 3 stands out significantly compared to the previous films, in both presentation and the very abundant lack of shits given to the actual story. Not to sugarcoat it at all, this is the worst of the three. And not just that it's less okay than the previous okay films, like no, it's just straight up not good at all in my opinion. I know the story for both of the previous films were very basic and boring, but I could at least give them credit for attempting a story in some aspects. Yeah, it once again has a very basic and generic plot, but in relation to the previous films, it feels strangely disconnected. Despite the weird continuity the second film introduced, and trust me, this movie doesn't help with that problem either, the first two kind of properly bled into each other. They were like two halves of a larger story. This movie fails to connect to the previous ones miserably. It doesn't even feel like a, yeah, this is its own standalone story kind of thing, as the beginning presents the last film's events like it happened relatively recently, which just raises too many damn questions. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but they never really made it clear as to how long after part 2 this takes place. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say a couple weeks or maybe a month or two, and I'll go over why that's important in just a bit. But like I mentioned earlier, presentation-wise, it also strays away significantly from what the last two films were aiming for. Instead of the very dark and eerie, suspenseful vibe, we have a more vibrant, bright, and colorful approach, which to me doesn't really work as well. I guess I can't really ignore it. Like I briefly alluded to in the summary, this movie tried to prioritize being in 3D, and the movie will make sure you know it every goddamn chance it gets. 3D in film was really picking up around the time, and I guess the filmmakers really wanted to cash in on it. I never watched the movie in 3D, and even if I did, I still think all the stuff they tried to do would come across stupid as hell. They try to shove so much damn shit into the camera at such a consistent pace, it's almost comical. I think because they were aiming so much to have this be in 3D, it has this very weird effect around it, and it's a little distracting, at least to me personally. I don't know what it's called, but it's that multicolored thing they have to make the 3D effect work. Try and guess who here doesn't understand film technology that well. It adds more to the vibrancy that I mentioned earlier, and it really ruins any sense of atmosphere that this movie could have had. I'm not saying a horror film set during the day or prominently bright and vibrant can't work. I'm not opposed to the idea, but this really didn't do it for me. The main location this film resides in, Higgins Haven, doesn't really set itself apart that much from the last film's settings. But I guess I'll bring it up here. It is weird how much time they dedicate to the barn at this place. It's not a bad location for the film to center prominently around, but I just kind of wished it was utilized better. It's decked out with various weapons and stuff, and it'd be cool to see Jason or any of the other characters toy around with this stuff more. I bring this place up because there are a bunch of scenes where we're meticulously venturing around and exploring this thing, and the climax spends a healthy amount of time here, and it's just a little weird is all. The characters in this movie circle back to being pretty generic and bare bones. Our final girl, Chris, is I think the most effective final girl out of the three in these original films. Now, she doesn't have as much going for her as a character like Ginny did, even though they tried their damnedest to give her something. She shows a lot of sheer determination that you can't help but root for her as she fights tooth and nail to evade Jason, like any proper final girl should. They give her this weird as hell backstory where 2 years prior to this film's events, one night she went out on her own to get her parents mad. She ran into Jason, who I guess tried to kill her, and maybe I'm dumb, but it may be implied that he full-on raped her, before she awoke sometime afterwards in her room where her parents didn't explain what the hell happened to her. She full-on had an ending to part 2 happen where she just gets attacked by the motherfucker before waking up not knowing what the hell happened. This is such a weird backstory because it's never properly elaborated or explained what the hell even happened. I hate how that's such a recurring thing in this series, that they just refuse to explain shit. I know it's meant to tie her story to Jason in a meaningful way, but it doesn't really do anything to connect me or make me care about her as a character more. It's just kind of weird. Jason, performance-wise, is a significant step up from the last movie. And this movie is, of course, where we see Jason don his iconic hockey mask. The mask for this character is so iconic, it trumps the fucking sport it was used for. Don't lie to me and say that when you see a hockey mask, your immediate thought isn't either Jason Voorhees or Casey Jones. Jason just has a more intimidating and foreboding presence here, and it really sets the stage for how Jason will be portrayed in future films. They also establish that this motherfucker is persistent as all living hell. If there's a problem I have with Jason, it's that for Chris's backstory, unless I missed something and I'm just being dumb, they kind of throw away the thing from part 2 about Jason primarily designating around Crystal Lake for the sake of having him randomly go after Chris. This felt like an odd decision to me. Now for the rest of the cast. Other than Jason and Chris, the only other notable character would be Shelley, the film's resident punching bag. Yeah, I really couldn't stand this guy, with his mopey Debbie Downer ass attitude. They try to make him the sympathetic type where you're meant to feel sorry for how much of a loser he is, but it really doesn't work, as he just comes across as painfully annoying 90% of the time. His date Vera existed. Same with the horny couple Debbie and Andy. One could do handstands and the other was pregnant, I guess. Okay, if I probably wasn't showing the clips, it'd be funny as hell to have y'all discern which is which, I'm not gonna lie. The stoner couple, whose names I forget, were just that, the stoners. Not gonna lie, they had some pretty fun interactions, though they were far and few between. The biker gang were some pretty fun additions, not gonna lie. Even though their role was minor, they added some decent bits of comedy to the film. Rick as well just existed. He was Chris's love interest, and that's about as noteworthy as he is. Okay, I'll say he does have one of the cooler kills in the movie, not gonna lie. Speaking of which, the practical and gore effects in this one were fantastic. Compared to part 2, we're actually allowed to see more of these for more than a split second, and they all look great. The head-crushing kill looks pretty sick. The guy getting cut in half was also cool as hell. The under-the-hammock stab looked cool and was a neat homage to the original. The effects on Jason also looked sick as hell. I know I didn't bring it up when discussing part 2, but even though it wasn't my preferred look, the makeup effects on Jason did look pretty cool. But this? Oh hell yeah, I love me some mutant swamp boy Jason. A characteristic about this Jason that was so fun when watching it again was to see how much fun he has fucking with these guys. That fucked up little smile and laugh he did was pretty damn eerie, and it caught me off guard. Something else I want to bring up is the whole chronology of this movie. Like I said, I assume this movie takes place at most maybe a couple weeks after Friday Part 2. So that begs the question as to how Jason went from looking like a half hillbilly, half mutated man to just going full on mutant in such a short span of time. Just one of those weird continuity things I can't help but mention. The film's ending as well is just so damn odd. They try to do the whole dream sequence like ending again, except somehow worse? Chris presumably kills Jason, takes a nap out on the lake like the original, is seen being frantic as shit before being pulled under by Pamela Voorhees? What the hell is going on here? What purpose do these serve at this point? In the first, it was to build mystery and intrigue around Jason. With these last two, they just feel like they're thrown in for the sake of being surprising. It's honestly really lame. Overall, Friday the 13th Part 3 was not very good. The story is non-existent, with much more care being brought to the very dated and comical usage of 3D effects. The presentation as well fails to live up to the previous two films, as it goes for a more vibrant feel and tone, which to me just doesn't work. The characters as well were as bare bones as ever. The kills and gore, however, did look pretty sick, but as a whole, it really just doesn't work that well for me.
So, with all that said, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, let me know right down there in the comments below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. This is Darian of GNB Productions, and take care.